Welcome back. Hope you had a good day yesterday. We're going to pick up with the U.S. and its involvement in World War I. But before we get to that, let's talk about some things that came about during this same time period that's not war-related. A few years before the war broke out in Europe, an American named Hugh Moore had an idea for a new kind of cup. He was trying to sell water at a penny a cup. Customers were not especially interested in paying for water, but they did like the paper cups that Moore used. At that time, health issues were receiving much national attention. Sounds familiar. Previously, the public had shared communal cups or dippers at public drinking places. But when a study revealed the abundance of germs on a public drinking vessel, Americans were shocked. Moore's health cups became extremely popular. In 1919, he renamed the product Dixie Cups, after the Dixie Doll Company near his house. In subsequent years, his invention was used to hold everything from soda pop to ice cream. Children found new toys to play with in the decade of the Great War. One toy was actually a recreation of an old favorite, the rag doll. They fixed it up, in 1915, a cartoonist, John Gruelle, and his daughter Marcella found an old rag doll. They fixed it up, and he drew a face on it. What should they name the doll, he thought. Gruelle looked up at his shelf of books and saw a collection of poems by James Whitcomb Riley. Among them were The Raggedy Man and Little Orphan Annie. He combined the two names to create Raggedy Ann. Gruelle made up stories about the doll to amuse his daughter and eventually published them as the Raggedy Ann stories. The book and accompanying doll were big hits, and got a big brother named Andy in 1920. War-era children also had the opportunity to build things with their toys. One popular building toy came courtesy of a well-known family in the architectural world. In 1876, Mrs. Anna Wright saw learning toys, including building blocks used in a demonstration kindergarten. She ordered a set of toys for her son, Frank Lloyd Wright, and he became interested in building. Frank apparently passed on his appreciation for such toys to his son, John Lloyd Wright, who was also an architect. In 1917, John designed toy-sized logs that children could use for building. He called them Lincoln Logs. So hopefully that was just a little idea. Hopefully you've heard of some of these toys before, these things that were used. But recognize, of course, this is what children had to enjoy, to entertain themselves with as the war progressed. Let me skip over to today's lesson. If you were the president, after what event would you have declared war against Germany? We've talked now about different events in the war. What would have caused America to join the war if you were president? Or, even more so, would you have declared war yet? Perfectly an opinion question, but something to think about. Roman numeral 3, the United States at war. By the time the U.S. entered the war, the Allies were in a desperate condition. For example, Germany's submarine warfare had limited the amount of food supply in Britain to just 3 weeks. They were really dealing with difficulties. So, immediately to supply the Allies, the U.S. used something called the convoy system. Supply ships protected by destroyers. These convoys included anti-submarine weapons such as depth charges, and it helped cut shipping losses. Not a single American soldier of the 2 million who came over was killed by a submarine attack. So I'd say the convoy system was pretty successful. America provided manpower, a boost in morale, and war material that would outmatch the Central Powers. Food, clothing, munitions, ships, and vehicles poured into Europe. However, all of that had to begin somewhere. Although war was declared in 1917, U.S. impact would not be felt until 1918. Letter A, a lack of military preparedness. At the beginning of the war, the U.S. had only 200,000 men in uniform, very different from the war military that we have today, which boasts millions of Americans. But remember, many Americans at this time still feared a strong, standing army during peacetime. So, we had about 200,000 men in uniform. The U.S. had only 400 heavy guns and enough ammunition for a 9-hour bombardment. They had no tanks, no air force. All of these problems had to be solved. So, the draft was used for the first time since the Civil War, placing about 4 million men into service. Local draft boards were in charge. The system worked well, and there was far less opposition to the draft than there had been during the Civil War. The recruits were trained at 32 camps across the U.S. Fun little fact for you guys to know. Of course, you guys know that I'm big fan of researching family history. I've got my brother who does a lot of that for me. But fun fact, my great-grandfather was one of the soldiers who served during World War I. So it's kind of a cool thing to know, and I never would have known had it not been for the research done. Again, highly recommend that you guys, to the best of your ability, do the same. Letter B. Production for the war. As the soldiers headed off for war, they needed resources to fight in that war. The War Industries Board organized industrial production by building wartime material. Uniforms, guns, ammunition, vehicles, medical supplies were top priorities during this time. The U.S. also took control of the railroads in order to transport war materials more efficiently. Shipping priorities ensured that weapons, ammunition, and other war materials reached ports, even if non-essential goods had to be held up. It's called sacrificing for the war effort. The government also sought to conserve the nation's fuel. It asked citizens to walk more. They added what were called gasless days to weekly calendars. After all, gas was needed for the war, and wasting it in America could prove deadly to a soldier. Americans were asked to limit food consumption. Herbert Hoover, future president of the U.S., was the main man responsible for being in charge of the Food Administration. In fact, one of the things that Americans began doing was to build their own, what we called, victory gardens. The Allies were starving in Europe. Rather than force the people to conserve food, they established voluntary programs. Americans were asked to make Mondays wheatless, Tuesdays meatless, Thursdays porkless. Victory gardens were homemade gardens so that more food would be available for the soldiers. All of these efforts made Americans feel that they were a part of the war effort. Before the war began, the U.S. shipped about 7 million tons of food to Europe. By the end of the war, it was over 18 million tons of food. Also, more women will join the workforce, and more people will join volunteer groups to help the war effort. Because 4 million men were now gone fighting, women joined the workforce. When the war ended, some of these women continued working. Volunteer groups increased by making items to help the soldiers like roll bandages, knitting sweaters and socks, or preparing packages to send abroad. Because of a lack of workers, wages shot up, prices shot up, and the War Labor Policies Board was created to regulate laborers. Because there were less people working, workers could demand higher salaries. Because the government was also buying a large amount of the goods in the U.S., prices also shot up. The War Labor Policies Board helped settle disputes between business owners and labor unions. Labor unions continued to grow in popularity during this time. Also, one more group to mention, more blacks will move from the Deep South to find work in the northern cities. In fact, more than 500,000 blacks moved north during this time period. When the war ended, many blacks remained there. Letter C, informing the public. Understand, a huge propaganda campaign in the U.S. sought to assure Americans that the fight was just and to despise anything that was German. Talented artists designed recruitment posters and ads like this one you see here. Help crush the menace of the seas. Buy Liberty bonds. Buy quickly, buy freely. The idea of German submarine warfare was just barbaric and cruel, the menace of the seas, and we need to support the war effort. Army lecturers appeared at local assemblies and at films to give short talks on any number of patriotic topics and moved crowds to cheers or tears. Americans began to hate all things German. School orchestras refused to play music made by Bach, Beethoven, or Wagner. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Hamburgers were called Liberty Burgers. And the German measles were called patriotic spots, opposing everything that was German. And lastly today, paying for the war. How did America pay for the war? The U.S. will spend about $24 billion on the war, about 1/4 of it coming from taxes and bank loans. A major part of the money to finance America's war effort came from Liberty and Victory loan drives. Liberty drives, Victory drives, they called it. Most of the money the U.S. got came from these volunteer efforts. Another way was to buy Liberty bonds or thrift stamps. These were ways Americans could help the war effort monetarily. Workers went door to door asking the American people to buy war bonds called Liberty bonds. By the way, today you can still buy government bonds. Basically, you give them a certain amount of money. They give you a bond in return equal to that value of money. That way the government has the money right away, and you've got a bond. Now, you can cash that bond in any time, get your money back, or the wiser thing would be to hold on to the bond until it matures, and then it increases in value. That way you could actually make money off of what you've given the government, but you have to hold on to it for a while. They were called Liberty bonds during this time. Goals in cities were set, and great celebrations occurred when the drives went what they called over the top. Thrift stamps were purchased each week by children, which could eventually be exchanged for a $50 bond. All right, students, that's all we're going to cover for today. If you could draw a line in your notes, recognizing that the notes that we've covered so far, Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3, will be the material that you'll be referring to in taking your quiz, which is in your packet. Please remember, of course, to take this quiz sometime this week and to turn it in when you come in to grab your next week packet. That's all we got time for today. Be good, do good.